So it's a great pleasure to welcome everybody online, and a big thank you for everybody in the room. But most importantly, a big thank you for our keynote speaker, Professor Michael Ignatieff, who is joining us to give what I think is a very important presentation on what if democracy's greatest enemy is democracy itself. Very important given the state of the world right now and some of the very, very sobering trends we're seeing in terms of democratic backsliding, growing autocratization. And of course, for everyone in the room and everybody at home, Professor Ignatieff is somebody who does not need an introduction. He has had a long and very important academic career. He's an academic, he's a writer, but he's also been a politician between 2006 and 2011. Michael Ignatieff was MP, obviously in the Parliament of Canada, but also leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, leader of the official opposition, and played a very important role in our politics, obviously. And he was also, until recently, the rector and president of Central European University in Budapest. So obviously he was somebody who lived, experienced very closely some of the patterns that concern us in the world today. He stepped down at the end of July 2021, but stayed on as professor of history, and he's kept writing, obviously, and his latest book is called On Consolation, Finding Solace in Dark Times. So we will be hearing his presentation, which will then be moderated by a very good colleague of mine, also does not need a lot of introduction. Professor Nick Cheeseman is professor of democracy at the University of Birmingham, and he's director of the university's new Center on Election, Democracy, Accountability, and Representation, CEDAR. I encourage everybody to go check out CEDAR's website. He served for a long time as director of Oxford's African Studies Center, and then moved to the University of Birmingham, where he is within the International Development Unit. He's also author of many books, and of which, not his latest, but one that matters is How to Rig an Election. So Professor Ignatieff, without further ado, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, and greetings from Vienna. I wish I could be there in person. Je vais parler en anglais, mais j'ai le plus grand respect pour le bilinguisme de l'Université d'Ottawa. Et je pourrais prendre des questions en français si vous voulez. I've chosen a deliberately provocative title. I'm a convinced Democrat, and having been elected in politics myself, I'm even more convinced Democrat. But I'm concerned that when we explain the contemporary social situation, the global situation is a battle between authoritarianism and democracy. And when we characterize internal battles within democracies as a conflict between democracy and authoritarianism, when, for example, Joe Biden announces that in 2024, democracy is on the ballot, I do find myself asking, what democracy? Whose democracy? Democracy, after all, is the only political system and the only language of political legitimacy where the question of what is and isn't democratic is the central issue the system itself is built to resolve. So if democracy is an argument about what democracy is, then we better be clear about which meaning of democracy we're standing by. We ought to be careful about denouncing as undemocratic visions of democracy we disagree with. And we need to stand up to all attempts to legitimize authoritarianism using the language of democracy. So let me start there with the ways in which democracy is used to legitimize tyranny. Democracy is the reigning principle of political legitimacy in the modern world. Whether that regime is electoral autocracy, guided democracy, illiberal democracy, or leader democracy, they all use the word to legitimize themselves. Half of the world's population, 4 billion people, are going to be holding elections in 2024, and The Economist intelligence unit tells us that 43 of 71 of these contests will be free and fair, but 28 of them will be neither free or fair. And we've had a recent experience of one of these elections, Vladimir Putin's re-election at 88% of the vote. And these are regimes, Putin's being the best example, which claim a democratic legitimacy that they hardly deserve. And this raises the first issue about democracy that I want to focus on, and it's a promiscuous legitimizer. Everybody uses democracy to give themselves a good name, but when democracy gives legitimacy to tyranny, it gives democracy a bad name. And it's not just that democracy's promiscuous legitimizes tyranny. It can also legitimize the use of democracy to abolish democracy altogether. And that's something I've seen firsthand in Viktor Orban's Hungary. He's won 4 elections since 2010, and he's used the democratic mandate to marginalize the Constitutional Court, to rewrite the Constitution to reinforce his authority, to sell off state media to regime cronies. He's expelled universities, including my own, and brought the rest under state control. He rules not through law, but by emergency decree, bypassing parliament altogether. He privatizes state assets and hands them to party loyalists. And the corruption in the regime is not an excess or an abuse or just bad private behavior. It's the driving engine of the entire regime. He then denounces any internal or external critique of the regime as undemocratic, particularly when that criticism comes from the European Union in Brussels. He denounces Brussels as Moscow, as if Brussels was the heir of Soviet despotism. But it's done with utmost cynicism. He runs against Brussels Monday through Friday and cashes their subsidy checks on Saturday and Sunday. And so what Orban has done to democracy is an enormous shock and surprise to a club that is supposedly a union of democracies. And it's a surprise to the whole history of the accession process, because that process was designed to consolidate, not destroy democracy in Eastern Europe. And the EU now sits there finding its structural transfers being siphoned off to demolish the primary components of democracy itself, because he's privatizing state assets to create a national bourgeoisie dependent on him. And in doing so, he creates his own electorate. And by using state power to fund and create a permanent electoral base, the goal is to make authoritarian rule permanent. And this is what illiberal democracy or electoral autocracy looks like: single party or single leader rule legitimized by elections. And it's not just the ruling system in Hungary. It was until recently the ruling system in Poland. And it might become the future for the largest democracy of all, which is India, currently holding elections. So electoral authoritarianism, which is a form of authoritarianism that does not require police terror, does not require overt repression. It merely requires use of the latest social media tools and 24/7 digital campaigning, is the new face of democracy in the 21st century. So much for electoral authoritarianism. Let's look at full democracies. Even where democracy meets the standard of legitimacy, that is multi-party political competition, free and fair elections, in those cases where social polarization weakens trust and inter-elite cooperation, democracy risks degenerating into an unending argument about what democracy is. And the accusation that some act or speech is undemocratic becomes the chief weapon of political combat. And when this happens, it can endanger democracy itself. So to the south of us, or to the south of you at least, Biden says in 2024, democracy is on the ballot. The interesting thing is that his opponent, Trump, agrees. because he claims that Biden stole the election and is using the courts to deny him the right to stand. So both sides claim that they are defending democracy against usurpation. And then, so the question then becomes, what democracy are we talking about here? Are we talking about power to the people, majoritarian democracy? Or are we talking about liberal democracy, which I would define as power checking power to keep the people free? This argument about the very roots of democracy is so embittered that we have reason to fear that in November, neither side will accept the result of a democratic election. And democracy would break down altogether when losers fail to accept losing and when winners are denied the legitimacy of victory. And this, for the first time in Canadian political experience of America, takes us into absolutely uncharted waters. And at the root of it is an argument about democracy that has become toxic and destructive of democracy itself. Now, in Canada, we like to think that these arguments are happening somewhere else far away and that our arguments about democracy are settled. I'm not so sure about that. I think an argument about democracy has long been built into our federal system, for example. Our question is always, who should rule? What level of government should rule? The provinces, who claim they're closer to the people, or those fancy pants East Coast elites based in Ottawa? And so Western alienation is not just a regional claim for more resources and more respect. It's a claim that democracy is being denied and needs to be taken seriously as such. And this alienation is not only regional, it's not only political, it's not only ideological, it's also social. The question is, who should rule? The people or the elites who run the counter-majoritarian institutions of a liberal state, courts, regulatory agencies, free medias, and the universities. Authoritarian populists, Trump especially, have been very successful at portraying themselves as defenders of the people against the privileged, self-dealing elites who run counter-majoritarian institutions. And so a battle over democracy becomes a social struggle between the people versus the elites, and both sides, populists and liberal Democrats, defending their conception of democracy. This is obvious enough, but if democracy itself becomes the stake in the battle for power in our political systems, democratic principles very easily can legitimize extremism. Because once democracy becomes the ballot question, once it becomes existential, democracy can legitimize people in their belief that they need to take the law into their own hands. And this is an old problem in democracy, not a new one. Nations whose democracies were born in revolution, for example, the United States and France, have faced recurrent insurrectionary challenges whenever people believe their version of democracy is in danger. In France, the Revolution of 1789 created modern French democracy, but it then set in train revolutionary refoundings of French democracy every generation, 1830, 1840, 1848, 1870. 1945, after recovery from defeat, was a democratic refounding. 1958, when de Gaulle takes power and creates the Fifth Republic, was another democratic refounding, revolutionary in character, though peaceful. And this history helps you to explain why in 2017, when the Gilets jaunes rose up against carbon taxes on fuel, and some extremists among them sacked the Arc de Triomphe, they claimed that they were following in a revolutionary, insurrectionary tradition built into the democratic traditions of France. And so democracy has a long-standing relationship with revolution, and to that degree, it has a powerful role in legitimizing violence when people claim that their will has been ignored, thwarted, or denied. And this pattern is true in the United States, also a democracy founded in revolution. From the Whiskey Rebellion in 1796 through the Southern Secession and Civil War of 1860s to the states' rights resistance to the federal desegregation of the 1950s and 60s, to the Capitol insurrection on January 6, 2021, democracy itself has recurrently legitimized the idea of people taking the law into their own hands to rescue the republic when an elite tries to steal an election. That's why people are wearing, revolutionary garb as they storm the Capitol, to claim the legitimacy for violent actions on the basis of America's revolutionary origins. Now, again, what does this have to do with Canada? Canada's democratic tradition, if anything, is counter-revolutionary, since we're the creation of Ancien Regime, New France, and the loyalist emigration from the American Revolution. But even though we have those origins, we can't insulate ourselves from American political ideas, and they've always had a strong influence for the better and for the worse in our political systems. The Freedom Convoy, the truckers' occupation of Parliament Hill in 2022, was a nonviolent protest aimed at forcing government to change policy on mass mandates for truckers. It was nonviolent, but it was ultimately a democratic challenge to the authority of a duly elected government and a warning sign. Civil disobedience and challenges to civil order become inevitable when a group feels they're not listened to, heeded, or respected. And if civil disobedience goes unheard over time, it won't just be aggrieved minorities who walk away from democracy. It might be the rest of us as well. So this reminds us that democracy is a practice of respect. It's not just a set of institutional procedures to choose our rulers. It's a way of life organized around certain crucial moral promises. Each should count for one, and no one to count for more than one, as Bentham said. Equality of voice, equality of respect, the rule of law, not the rule of men. Democracy makes these moral promises and tries to live by them, and its institutions are judged by these promises. And when it fails to meet these promises, democracy invites disillusion. And this is a structural problem in all democracies, but especially so in ones that have tried to regulate capitalist societies, because capitalism generates inequalities, which recurrently challenge the political equality on which the legitimacy of democracy depends. It's a point made very centrally by John Rawls in The Theory of Justice, that liberal democracy assumes political equality, not social equality. Political equality means equality of participation, equality of rights, equality of respect. And this is held, when it works, when it is enacted, to counterbalance and offset social inequality and the unequal power of the rich. But this is a very precarious bargain. It may only work when capitalism is extending its benefits to everyone, or as many people as possible. So only as long as there is growth does political equality contain resentment that builds against social inequality. If growth stagnates and social inequality increases as the power of the rich over the political process grows, political equality seems to hollow out. It becomes a hollow promise to those whose incomes are stagnating or falling behind and who feel a deficit of respect, a deficit of equal consideration. As social inequality grows, economic elites come to capture political elites, especially whereas in the United States, they have a constitutional doctrine that money is speech and is entitled to constitutional protection and cannot be regulated in the political arena. Thank God Canada does not subscribe to that particular piece of constitutional nonsense. Elite capture by the rich, also in Canada, erodes political equality. It weakens trust and it erodes democracy. And when growth fails, or when growth creates new inequalities, political equality has little chance to contain or counteract social and economic inequality. And this, it seems to me, the inability of political inequality, our democratic commitments, our inability of those moral promises we make to our citizens to contain the social inequality that they see and economic inequality they see all around them, seems to me represents the core crisis of the liberal democratic model. And once rich and powerful minorities secure control of the political process, democracy degenerates into a competition among well-resourced minorities. Liberal democracy's strength, which is checking power to keep the people free, then makes matters worse because it empowers vetoes by minority interests that make decisive action on the people's business more difficult. The most obvious example of this, of course, is the influence of moneyed lobbyists for the oil industry, slowing action on climate change to a crawl. A second example is the ways in which the monopolies who own social media platforms that have monetized the public arena are so powerful that they make it nearly impossible for the state to do what democracies have done for centuries, that is, to regulate and safeguard a public space for democratic debate that is reliable, safe, trustworthy, and free. So instead of counter-majoritarian institutions doing what they're supposed to do, particularly regulatory agencies, that is, protecting the public, they become captured or immobilized by moneyed elites. And so the climate emergency and our difficulty about regulating social media is showing up the way in which democracy is failing to broker interests and reach compromises that we need in order to both save the planet and save the public space. So look, democracy is in crisis. Everybody's saying it, and I'm not disagreeing, but I'm trying to describe it perhaps a little differently. It's a crisis of promiscuous legitimation. Democracy is legitimating authoritarians and giving the whole concept a bad name. It's also legitimating two competing versions of democracy, majoritarian versus liberal. And when these two visions of democracy are challenged, it legitimates violence. It legitimates the people taking the law into their own hands. So democratic rhetoric is a source of structural instability in our system. It creates instability in another way because it creates expectations of respect and equality that it can't satisfy in highly unequal and socially unjust societies. And it empowers veto points that render it too slow to respond to crisis, especially the climate emergency. And this crisis, I've tried to say, is also a social crisis because the natural constituency of liberal democracy, the people who are viscerally and have an interest in protecting liberal democracy, are the liberal professions: law, medicine, journalism, academia, and the media. These are the professions that care about counter-majority institutions because they run them. If a populist authoritarian can mobilize resentment against these professions, as they've done, leaders can erode support for the institutions themselves. They use the language of we the people to create majorities hostile to the counter-majoritarian institutions that are supposed to help keep the people free. So what's my conclusion? A crisis of promiscuous legitimization means everyone uses democracy to suit their own purposes. And given that democracy is an unending argument between competing social groups about what democracy is, it's pretty fruitless to expect that usage will not continue to be promiscuous. Academics like me are always trying to clean up the language, and it never works. The word is just intrinsic to the battle for power between democratic and authoritarian states and between democratic and authoritarian competitors within states. So what do we do? I mean, I think a defense of democracy in these conditions requires knowing A, what version of democracy we're defending and why, B, understanding that we're defending an argument about what democracy is and trying to keep that argument free and fair, and understand consequently that this is a debate without closure. And C, understanding that the core crisis that democracy faces is a gulf between what our democracies promise and what they can deliver. And the version of democracy that we should be defending, no surprise, is a form of government, self-government, in which power checks power to keep the people free. That's what I mean by democracy. And our best hope of defending democracy to the general public is that it's the best guarantee of their freedom. It's not a guarantee of perfect justice or perfect equality, but it must be a guarantee of their freedom. Freedom from executive overreach, media tyranny, bureaucratic incompetence, or malice. But a commitment to democracy in these terms is not a commitment to the status quo, but a commitment instead to narrow the gap between what democracy promises and what it delivers. So what would this mean in practice? I think it has to mean strengthening the accountability and transparency rules that govern the conduct of ruling elites who run counter-majoritarian institutions. We have to clean up our act, and the sooner we do, the better. We also have to find a way to tighten up the rules that reduce the power of moneyed lobbyists. We have to maintain public control of money in politics and independent bipartisan control of elections. These are things that Canada has succeeded in doing. They're absolutely vital that we care about them, sustain them at all points. We need to promote a very old-fashioned ideal, a culture of public service based in transparency and accountability. I think Ottawa needs to remember always what I think was true of public servants that I knew in my childhood, that they are really there to serve the people of Canada. And sometimes the public services create an impression that it serves only itself. We also need to reinforce rules against self-dealing and nepotism, both in the public service and in publicly funded institutions like universities. We need to protect institutional whistleblowers and empower a free press's right to know. We need more freedom of the press, more freedom of information, not less. We need to strengthen democratic representation. And based on my experience in Parliament, this will mean loosening the power of the whips so that we can revive and recreate free debate in the House of Commons. The House of Commons is an empty shell dominated by party discipline. And as a former party leader, I think the control that party leaders need over their caucuses is strangling parliamentary democracy. We also need to think about how we can devolve power and taxing power to regions and municipalities and cities. We need to formalize citizen assemblies, which have proven their worth in Ireland and lots of other places, and begin to experiment more with e-voting. But perhaps the most important thing of all, and I say this as a teacher, is commit fiercely to an equality agenda, using education to equalize opportunities and life chances. This is the key to sustaining the legitimacy of political equality in a capitalist society. So we're going to have to reinvent and reinvigorate our democracy, and we've done so in the past. We keep doing so, but we really need to do it now if democracy is to survive. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much, Michael, for a fabulous, absolutely fabulous lecture. I'm sure that was very thought-provoking for everybody here, and I like the way that you engage not only with the challenges that are beyond, but also the challenges that are within. For everybody online, and we've got a wonderful online audience, thank you so much for joining us. Please, to ask your questions, put them in the Q&A box. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. If you click on that, you'll be able to open the questions. Michael, if you want a preview of the questions that are coming your way, you can also click on the Q&A box there. I should say we're also at a wonderful event here at the University of Ottawa, and we've got people in the room who also have their hands up. So I'm also going to throw the opportunity over to them. I'm going to start with what might be an even more provocative question than your provocative talk, which is, I agree with everything you say, particularly about the points you made about equality, particularly about the points around the way that we need to change our own democracies in Western democracies as much as worry about the erosion of democracy elsewhere. All of those points hit home to me. The one question I have is what we need to do about citizens, because it seems to me that at the minute citizens are part of the problem. You know, Trump isn't really competing to be with a different vision of American democracy, right? He's told us that if he's leader, he's going to be dictator on day one. He then told us he wouldn't be dictator after a few days once things were sorted out, but he was very clear that he was dictator on day one. So he's not actually competing over the term democracy in the way that some of those you talked about are. And yet he's ahead in the polls and probably on course for victory in the US elections. So I completely agree with everything you said, but I also wonder whether one of the things we need to talk about is the citizenry and why the citizenry is voting the way that it is. Now, I completely agree with your point that people have been let down. We have governments that have allowed multiple forms of inequality, stagnating growth, but also stagnating class mobility in a way that has frustrated citizens. I think that's true. But citizens have often had choices. Now, citizens voted for Trump rather than for Hillary. Citizens voted for Brexit. Citizens voted for a conservative government rather than the Labour one led by Jeremy Corbyn. In all of those moments, citizens had an opportunity to vote for more redistribution and vote for more equality and did not. And I think that's one of the things that's really striking to me. If we go back to Alexis de Tocqueville, if we go back to some of the classic democracy theory, one of the things they were scared about was people always voting for equality, for the absence of elites, for what that would do. It's gone the other way. We actually have big majorities in most countries that vote for center-right politics that sustain and foster inequalities. So one of the things I guess I would be interested in hearing from you about is why are citizens not voting for policies when they genuinely have them on the ballot that would encourage the kinds of equality and transformation that you're talking about? Anyway, don't want to abuse my moderator principles for too long. So that's for me. I might come within the room first, and then I'll start reading out some of these questions. As I say, please do put your Q&A in at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we'll read them out. Okay, Roland, do I need to pass this mic over, or can you talk into one of those? Okay.
Well,
and I'll just say quickly, I'll ask everybody who's going to ask a question just to introduce themselves so Michael knows who he's talking to and the people on Zoom know the audience.
Thank you, Nick. And I have a variant of your question. And Michael, it's Roland Paris here. It's really lovely to see you on the screen. Hope you're doing well.
Hi, Roland.
Yeah, I also had a question about citizens, although slightly different. And I couldn't agree more with your analysis. And you identify a number of ways, practical ways in which some of these risks can be dealt with. Transparency, reaffirming the checks and balances, essentially making sure the system isn't leaving people behind, especially in a chronic way, even using education for the purposes of quality of opportunity. But it's on the education side that I wonder if you could comment as an educator, as somebody who thinks about these social conditions as well, because in addition to everything else, we're also experiencing an epidemic of gullibility. And, you know, some of the folks who showed up at the truck protests that you mentioned believed that if they could just persuade the governor general to sign some document, that would mean that there would be a change of government. Polls show again and again that these not just but anti-democratic sentiments are associated with misapprehensions about things that are, you know, just factually, just easily demonstrable. So the question is, I guess, about how we deal with that aspect of the problem. Yeah, making sure the system appears to be fair and is fair, and making sure the system is working for everyone. But you know, the danger, of course, if I can just add one more thought, is that when you talk about education being the problem, you risk falling into the very trap of the anti-elitist response, which is, you know, you're being paternalistic. But education is part of the problem. So that's my thought / question. Thank you.
Boy, I was hoping I was going to have a kind of relaxing afternoon. I wouldn't have to work too hard, but that was a stupid assumption given that it's the University of Ottawa. But anyway, um, let me push back a little bit because we don't want to end up sounding like Bertolt Brecht's, ironic advice that we should really abolish the people and choose another one more to our liking. We've got the people we got, and we are the people just as much as anybody else. We shouldn't set up a us-them contrast. That one thing I learned in politics, they didn't vote for me, but I learned a pretty hard-earned respect for the basic common sense of the Canadian public. And I think it's a really serious mistake in thinking about this to underestimate their intelligence and discrimination about the things they know about, which cuts into Roland's very good points. I think there are two issues here. One, why don't they vote for things that are socially progressive and would reduce some of the inequalities of respect and consideration? But let's remember that they have. I mean, let's remember Obamacare, for example. Obamacare was fiercely, ferociously resisted by the insurance industry and was called socialized medicine for 30, 40 years. And it passed and is now steadily becoming essentially unbudgeable in the American political system. Obama may try to pull it away, but the basic idea that a society should create a system that assumes some collective responsibility for health seems to me a battle that we thought was lost in the 70s and 80s, but against all expectation has been won. We also have a system in which we have, and I because I worked in the States, am a beneficiary of American Social Security. There's an enormous expenditure by the federal government of the United States to sustain the old age security of the population. Let's not start the conversation assuming this has all been ripped up and is gone. It has very, very solid electoral support. And let's choose a third example that astonishes me, which is marriage equality. I mean, in 1965, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Toronto, I did not know a single gay person, not because they weren't there, but because they would not speak and would not avow their identity. Flash forward to 2015, 2016, I actually officiated at a marriage between two men who happened to be my former students in an Iowa cornfield. Well, unbelievable. I just think we need to remember these stories because they do indicate that you can make changes to stubbornly cautious and conservative electorates that ex ante you don't think are possible. So that's what I would say to what Nick was saying. I think you can get people to vote for things that are good for them, but we're going to have a hell of a battle in 2024. There's no question, and a hell of a battle in Canada. So that's one thing. Two Roland's very important points. As everybody says, and it's certainly true, we're living through the biggest revolution in communications technologies since Gutenberg, and it has empowered an enormous wave of disinformation and lies and viciousness. It's empowered mob rule, which we saw most recently in the attacks on the royal family and their feeble attempts to control the media storm. The one thing I notice from my students, again, I don't want to sound kind of hopelessly naive. What I notice among my students, and I notice among myself, is we're all getting smarter about social media. We are all beginning to grasp what this revolution is doing to our information sources. And all of us are beginning to curate more carefully. One of the unexpected effects, I think, of the social media revolution, I think, has been to reinforce the credibility, importance, and legitimacy of good information curation. So if you look at my feed on a given morning, it's, it's people who've been good journalists for, 200 years. I mean, the New York Times, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that phenomenon, that's an elite phenomenon, I grant you. I pay a lot of money to have curated information. So I, excuse my language, can tell the shit from the shinola, as we used to say. But I think a lot of people are moving to increasing curation because they just cannot get any stable ground in the media field we're having. So that I don't want to deny the seriousness of what Roland is saying, but I think a process of slow learning and self-correction is beginning to occur. There is intense reflection about what social media is doing to us, and some of it is leading us to curate and select information more carefully, and that, I think, helps us to sustain some basis for rational political choice.
Thanks so much. Okay, we've got a lot of fantastic conversations, and sorry, someone's saying there's a lot of echoes, so if we could shut down some of the other mics or maybe just turn them off for a second when they're not being used. Maybe to stay on that theme, but to bring in some of the questions we're getting. We've got a lot of great questions. We won't get through them all one-to-one, so I might group them a little bit. One of the sets of questions we hear is kind of probing this idea about, the relationship between economic equality, the challenges that democracy faces, and so on, through the sort of lens of polarization and partisanship. So Robin here at the bottom says, do you have any thoughts on how partisanship in parliament and outside is disrupting our democracy and alienating people so they join silos that slide into extremism? All this despite the polls showing that the vast majority of people seem to be reasonable. So that's one version of this question. I'll just give you a couple of others and you can pick the bits you want to come back on. Senator Cardoso has also joined us, thank you, and asks, there's also a growing hard-edged polarization in societies all over the world. What are your thoughts about how this can affect democracy? Of course, from an academic point of view, Levitsky and Giblat kind of argument about how democracies die is a lot about growing polarization and the end of tolerance and the way in which that's impacting on society. And some of what people are suggesting, I think, in some of the comments is that, that polarization doesn't seem to necessarily map onto the issues around equality. It's not particularly one group, or it's not necessarily always one socioeconomic group that finds that polarizing argument attractive. So maybe your sort of thoughts on those points on polarization and how that plays and relates to different kinds of identity. And then we'll take some of the other questions after that.
Well, because I'm an old professor, I'll begin with a footnote. I mean, I teach this stuff. I was teaching it this afternoon before I got on this call with you. I teach Madison and the Federalist on this very issue. In other words, I think it's important historically to remember that we misunderstand our problem if we think there's something absolutely new about this situation. Democracy is recurrently threatened by extreme forms of polarization. And we need to remember the extreme polarization in our own Canadian political tradition. The furious opposition to conscription in Quebec in 1944, and then again in 1917, the ferocious battles over free trade. We've just buried Brian Mulroney, and everybody now thinks this was, this is a political genius. But at the time, I remember being in Toronto and hearing people saying, I want to tear Brian Mulroney apart because he's going to destroy Canada if we go into the free trade. I mean, so let's, remember the history of our own polarizations and the ways in which we have resolved some of these difficulties. But there is a real issue here, and I think we're not understanding what's going on. I think, let me add a sort of odd thought. One of the things I learned when I went into active politics was the incredible importance of organized political parties as brokers of dialogue and contact between regions, groups, and interests around a country. One of the things that's really worrying about American politics is essentially the collapse of the party as a brokerage institution that puts us all in the room and has us talk. I mean, I'm a kind of metropolitan Toronto elitist, right? And that did me no bloody good in politics. But in the machine room of the Liberal Party, I was forced to listen to, Sikhs from, Vancouver and fishermen from Newfoundland. And we were all in the same room. And I learned an enormous amount about the importance of institutions as brokers of partisan dispute, because a political party can't get elected unless it can pull various interests together and focus them around a minimum creed. And it's a broad church that disagreements are sometimes suppressed, but this is a tremendously important instrument in preventing polarization. And there's some concern that the current Conservative Party in Canada has basically been taken over to the right, and the Conservative Party is losing its capacity to broker the center-right part of Canadian politics, the way the Liberal Party has, with the NDP, helped to brokerage and moderate partisanship on the center-left. I know parties are very unfashionable, but it raises the further issue, which I would identify, and some theorists are beginning to notice, which is that something is happening to our identities to the degree that we become more and more individualized. Political allegiance becomes the central identity, and this makes political identity much more ferocious. I mean, and so this is an aspect of partisanship that needs to be studied more deeply. It used to be the case, I think, that we had multiple identities, multiple commitments. Our social lives connected us to other groups in ways that allowed us to share identities with people with whom otherwise we disagreed politically. But now there's some way in which, if you don't have a certain view on Gaza, I can't talk to you because this is me, right? This seems very, very, there's something new here. The ways in which politics defines identity in ways that I don't remember politics defining identity when I was a young buck. I don't want to overdo that because there was a period in the 60s, for example, we're in the Vietnam War, and I referred also to the free trade debate, when politics did appear to define identity. But we're in a very extreme example of that. And I think it has to do with loneliness, isolation, individualism, and the ways in which politics has become, or political ideology has become a substitute and a replacement for richer cultural, religious, social identities that used to buffer and broker our engagement with each other.
Thanks. I wonder whether one other element that might play a role in that as well, just thinking about my own students, also being a teacher, is a kind of quest for a sort of moral purity. So there seems to, at times in my conversations, be a desire not to do anything or to support anything that could have any element that's dubious or incorrect, because then you're somehow, tainted by that. So, people
that's a very important addition to what I'm saying, because political identity has become a moral identity and a moralized identity. And that, I think, is really, this is the old liberal in me talking. I mean, because moral choice is always a little messy, political choice, super messy. So if you think, political choice is about, moral principle and everything else be damned, you're failing to read, Max Weber's interesting remarks about the conflict between an ethics of responsibility and an ethics of conviction. An ethics of conviction is killing our politics, in my view, to be really blunt about it.
And then you end up in a situation, of course, where you actually abstain, perhaps from voting, because you think that none of the choices are kind of morally pure, but then you disengage from having a say, and therefore your vote isn't counted. And I think that's something we
Correct.
perhaps need to work out how to engage it. But let me take another few questions. And again, I'm going to try and group them together a little bit. So we've got a question here for Marvin. Thank you, Marvin, on regarding the education factor. Do you feel that those who are espousing respect, equality, rule of law are speaking in an echo chamber? Do we need to do a better job in reaching out to younger people and groups who are feeling disillusioned? So hold that thought for a moment. We've also got a question closer down to the end from Viviana. Thanks for this. How can we encourage new generations and actors to bring to the table new and old ideas that may actually be well received given the current conditions we're experiencing? Timing is everything, and these proponents may become exceedingly discouraged about the future before they can make their mark. And finally, a kind of another question about practical steps here from Mark. Thank you, Mark, who says, you briefly mentioned citizens' assemblies. I consider them to be the next stage of democratic revolution that countries must embrace. But what would be your advice on actually advancing the creation of a people's parliament, permanent citizens' assembly with rotating membership, etc.? How would we actually go about doing that practically? So I think a lot of people here, being very, finding your ideas very resonant, but also asking for more on the practicality of what's the next step in pushing that agenda forwards.
Sure. These are great questions, and my answers are not going to be terrific. I am one of those who thinks that the university has surrendered in certain places its responsibility to be a place that doesn't promote a kind of, I'm worried about the dead weight of a kind of progressive ideology. It relates to our previous discussion in which we somehow think that the role of a university is to teach values of a progressive kind that then become the identity of our students. And I just think that's not what we do. We're here to challenge them. We're here to make them take their responsibilities. But I'm very worried about the ways in which the progressive professoriate, of which I'm one, I'm proud to be progressive, but I'm very worried about the ways in which we've given away and abandoned our role to be, to push back, to be critical, to defend unpopular and difficult ideas, and to create a framework in the university where people can learn that it is possible to disagree and to disagree civilly, in which we stop protecting students from things that we don't want them to hear and all that stuff. I mean, this is a familiar debate, and I won't go into it, but I just want to align myself clearly on that, on that era. And I am extremely concerned as a university teacher who's seen the incredible capacity of university learning to turn the lights on for kids. Just don't want us to abandon our vocation to reach out and reach out and reach out and give people a chance to have the lights go on. And, we've done let's not lose confidence here. I look at my graduation photographs from the 1969 graduating class at the University of Toronto. We're all white. Most of us are male. I mean, you flash forward to 2025, you compare the graduation photographs in the same university 50 years apart. It's just astonishing and wonderful and heartening. And I just hope we don't throw away the advantages that the benefits we've given to Canadian public life by opening the lights for a whole new generation of people from every corner of the world. And we need to do a much better job of dealing with poor white kids whose mums and dads didn't get a chance to go to college. I mean, we just need to really work hard on that, and reach out much more than we do and spend money on it, because we're in the business of changing lives, and we can do that, and I've seen it happen. So that's one part. There was another question, and I'm sorry, in my rhetorical flow, I kind of forgotten what it was, but perhaps you could remind me briefly, Nick, what it was. Oh, citizens' assemblies. Let me just say a little bit about that. It would take a little work for me to understand how you would integrate a permanent citizens' assembly into parliamentary government. I'm not saying it can't be done, but we've got to get the institutions right so that the supremacy of parliament in our system is preserved. But I see a constant role for citizens' assemblies when parliament faces very difficult public issues, ranging from medical assistance medical assistance in dying, the extension of that provision to those with mental illnesses, the issues that Parliament is wrestling with, some of the issues about climate change, the political trade-offs we need to make about climate. All of these, I think, would be enormously enriched by citizens' assemblies. The key is then to get the linkage right so that what a citizens' assembly says to a parliament is not dispositive, but it has to have weight and clout and impact. Because if it doesn't, citizens are too smart to waste their time in a talking shop that Parliament ignores. So I don't know how to fix that, but the example that everybody saw that worked brilliantly was Ireland, where Ireland basically committed ex ante that if these folks in the Citizens' Assembly come to a reasonable compromise on the abortion issue, Parliament will act in the direction they point. That's the right way. That's the right way to go. The thing that we all love about citizens' assemblies is critical to democracy. The idea that if you put 150 completely random people in a room, regardless of education, race, gender, national origins, and you give them the facts and you work with them and you allow deliberation, you can get some form of collective wisdom. This is what democracy is, and we need to revive the public's faith in that. And one very good way to do that is citizens' assemblies.
Really nicely to a comment from Deborah, which I think maybe more as a comment than the question, but I'll read it out, and then there's a couple of points here that's similar. And Deborah says, it seems to me that if rather than thinking of democracy as one person, one vote, multi-party elections, we took a definition more in keeping with Sen as a system in which public decisions are taken through open public reasoning, and of course in which people are able and encouraged to participate and others are willing to listen and seriously contemplate alternative ideas, it would be difficult to conclude that our current democratic governments are really democratic. Perhaps public intellectuals need to do more to challenge the common meaning of democracy as free and fair one person, one vote electoral systems, and instead to highlight the importance of public discourse. My sense is that you would probably agree with that, but I won't put words into your mouth. But I'll just read out a few other comments that perhaps speak to that.
I like having words put in my mouth, especially when I disagree with them, and I agree with them. Excuse me, and I agree with the very interesting comments that were just made.
Yeah, so thanks, Deborah. That's a really smart insight there. But just to read a few more sort of critical points in that same vein out, Steve here sort of suggests, are we actually seeing something in which what we're seeing in, for example, the US is democracy that's managed public theater, while the captured public policy outcomes of government are determined to serve economic and state power interests in ways that ignore citizens. So sort of more critical interpretation. And we've got a few questions here, both about the US and about Canada, in terms of the actual electoral system and whether the electoral system prevents certain more minority concerns coming to the fore. And I suppose reading in between the lines here of Mark's comment and Real's comment and a couple of others, there's perhaps a suggestion that, Parliament might act a bit more like a citizens' assembly if we had a different electoral system that allowed a broader, more diverse range of views to be elected. I guess the challenge to that is that Parliament might also make it, become a venue in which actual, moving effectively to respond to an issue becomes more difficult because everything gets bogged down in never-ending coalitional disagreements and agreements. But yeah. I wonder what your sense is in response to some of those questions about the importance of electoral system reform, of bringing about actual parliaments that are more representative, and about whether or not in some ways we're too kind to existing democracies and we should actually be much more critical about the standard of democracy. I mean, you were fairly critical in some of your comments, but I think some of our Q&A participants are encouraging you to perhaps be even more cynical in the current state of affairs.
Oh. Well, funnily enough, I sat in the Parliament of Canada and felt that in all kinds of ways that aren't sufficiently appreciated, it was a pretty representative body. I mean, the whole country was in that room in one way or the other. My problem was that they couldn't speak. My problem is party discipline in the House. I think it's very, very, and it produces a poignant reality of being a representative that I think needs to be talked about much more, which is that the public has a completely unrealistic view of what a member of parliament can do for them, and a completely unrepresentative idea of how we represent them. I mean, and do not appreciate just how rigidly the free speech of members of parliament is controlled by the whips. Now, it's strange for me to say this because I was a party leader, and I'll be frank with you. My first imperative as a party leader was to get the boys to shut up and line up behind me, because I just didn't want to have, I had enough problems. I didn't want to have my caucus blowing up on me. So I'm speaking against my own interests, and I'm also speaking against my own record. But I do think that the comparative study of parliamentary system shows that Canada has an unusually tight control over the capacity of MPs to speak freely in the House of Commons, much more so, for example, than in the House of Commons in Britain, where the Prime Minister faces recurrent revolts from his MPs. But I think a bumpier ride, a loosening of that, would do a lot to empower MPs to be able to stand up and represent the interests of their constituents against their own government, which is, I think, critical. And so that's a change that I think is important. As for further electoral reform, I mean, we got to be careful here and study carefully what happens elsewhere. I'm very fond of the Netherlands. I love going there, and I love, everybody loves Amsterdam. But their political system, which has opened up, has an incredible number of parties. It has proportional, and it sometimes takes a year and a half to form a government. So I remain cautiously in favor of first past the post, to the degree that it allows big parties to consolidate and aggregate interests. Broad churches, center right, center left, and a party further to the left. I think that does a good job for Canada, given how enormous we are, just how regionalized our political cultures are. I just think we've got to be very, very careful about electoral reform that further balkanizes the country, because we could easily have a Sask party, an Alberta party, a Manitoba party, a BC party, and I'm not sure at the end of the day we'd have a Canada at the end of it. So I'm sorry to be, conservative, cautious, and I don't want to sound as if I'm simply speaking in the interests of my former political party. That's not my point. My point is, how do we have a political system that maintains the national unity of our country? That's the issue to me.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask in the room whether we have a final question here, because I focused on the online questions for the last few rounds. So I'll see if there's any question here. In a minute, Michael, I'll ask you whether there's anything you'd like to say as a sort of final comment. I know we've had you on for a long time now and gone through a lot of questions, so we don't want to take up too much of your afternoon. I think one thing that strikes me that some countries do much better than others is that, there is a sort of process through which policy making is supposed to have a participatory dimension. And I think there are some other parts of the world that we could also learn from. This is slightly sidestepping the electoral system question. to think about other ways of doing this. In Kenya, for example, the 2010 constitution requires, as a constitutional requirement, that there should be public participation around policy making. And sometimes that's abused, sometimes it's not done very well, but there are places where you can go and see, you know, MPs or governors at the county level in Kenya sitting down with large rooms in town hall meetings and trying to do a version of collective planning on what should happen in the future for resources that actually have significant levels of popular engagement and buy-in, and in some of the best cases actually have special representation for different groups such as youth, elderly, disabled, etc., in ways that kind of recognize, you know, both the idea that everybody gets to choose and there might be an element of majority rule, but also that different groups have specific interests that should be taken into account within the community. And I wonder also in some of our countries, I'm thinking particularly, for example, in the UK, where perhaps we don't always do this, whether there are other ways of bringing in participation to the policymaking process that boost that sense of legitimacy and credibility, even within what's otherwise a more majoritarian system in terms of the electoral process. Anyway, within the room, do we have anybody who would like to come in with a final question? Okay, I think we're... Oh, we do have a question. Sorry, I was being blind. I'll just hand you the mic.
One of our students, so it's
Yeah, I'm actually a PhD candidate here at the University of Ottawa. I'm Francine Poviv. I just had a question, and I know this was touched upon at the Q&A about young people, because I think something that young people are facing, like myself right now, is a lot of discouragement, because there's a lot of issues that we're facing as our generation and future generations. And there's also discouragement through what I see in my own research on youth mobilization, on people not feeling reflected enough by their political system. There are not young people in the political system. There are a few, but it is an underrepresentation based on like the country's population. So what advice would you give to young people who feel, you know, disconnected from democracy, or are challenging the notions of democracy, or feel like their institutions are failing them by not taking these actions now on issues like climate change that are affecting our generation and future generations?
It's a great question, and there are a small number of countries in the world that have quotas for youth representatives in parliament, and almost none of them are in established Western democracies. So it's a great question. Thank you very much. Michael, I'll let you answer that one, and anything else you'd like to leave us with as parting words, and then we'll wrap up. Thanks so much.
When I think back to how I got involved in politics as a 17-year-old, it was because there was a thing called the Liberal Party of Canada, and it had candidates in Toronto ridings, and I literally went out and went to the local riding office and got some leaflets and walked up and down the street pretending to know what Lester Pearson wanted me to say to those voters, and knocked on doors and fell in love with the political process that way. And I don't want to take you down memory lane, because it ends up being a little insulting to your question, and I don't mean to be insulting. My point is that you've got to have a political system that has ways in for each new generation that comes around. The party had those ways open in the 60s. I don't know where we are now, but I've said recurrently in my answers so far, political participation depends on institutions that draw you in. And if we have weak political parties that are simply election machines, or machines for the election of a leader, and are entirely dominated and shaped by the leader, and have ceased to become policy generators, idea shops, places where you go to have fun, and above all, places where I had an awful lot of fun being a young liberal in the 1960s. I mean, some of the most exciting times of my life. And it wasn't all kind of, you know, dull, earnest social climbers trying to get to be ministers' assistants. We had a lot of fun. And I think you need to have institutions, in other words, that are constantly reaching out to young people and drawing them in. And then I think it's very important, Nick was saying this, we need processes in our parliaments, formal consultation in which it isn't strange to have university students or even high school students coming up to parliamentary committees in the House of Commons and giving testimony on a particular issue and problem. I think if you put that demand to young people and say, listen, on Tuesday, we're going to have a meeting on, youth unemployment in rural Canada. And we'd like you to show up and give us your perspective. If the political system reaches out to young people in that way, young people will respond magnificently. And we just need to do this. And that means chairmen of parliamentary committees need to be that kind of person. We need to have a civil service that isn't constantly in risk management, crouch to please their political masters, and reaches out as civil servants to young audiences around the country and saying, how can we recruit you into the civil service? How can we listen to your opinions? We have a huge job to do here. And if your generation is feeling disaffiliated, it's, I think, a sign of the institutional decay of our political parties and the institutional decay of our civil service and the defensive insularity of the parliamentary committee system. And all of that needs to be fixed.
Thank you so much for a really great talk. I think a mentor of mine said once, you can tell the quality of a talk by the quality of the questions. And I think we've had really brilliant questions today. So thank you so much. I think everyone's found it really enriching. Thanks everybody online. Sorry we didn't get to every single question, but there were so many, it was so rich. Hopefully you'll see that we tried to get a good sort of representation of all of your comments. And I'll just pass it back to Marie, our organizer today, to wrap up.
So, Michael, thanks, as Nick was saying, for this very, very rich talk. To paraphrase what you were saying earlier, you say that as academics, we basically wage a battle of words and new words, but obviously words matter. And you've offered us some new ones. I think a lot of us will be walking away with some of these new words to inspire and rejig some of our thinking, such as promiscuous legitimizer, right? Or legitimation, right? I think I also appreciated, and everybody else in the room probably appreciated, the fact that you did come with concrete solutions, or at least concrete action points with regards to what we can do. And that's building, obviously, on your experience as an insider within some of our political institutions, but also as an outside observer of some of the trends that we've been discussing today. So on behalf of my colleagues in the room, I want to say a big thank you for your presentation, et de la part de mon institution, vraiment un très, très gros merci pour cette présentation très, très enrichissante. Merci.
Merci. Merci. Thank you.